It was 854 last week. Ah, the good old days. That record barely lasted 7 days. Now it's over 1,000, quote, refugees in one day. In fact, 1,185, so almost 1,200. Almost all of them male, something like 87%, which widening sex imbalance will probably keep the young ladies of Rotherham on their toes. Has there ever been a more misnamed entity than today's UK border force? There's no border to enforce, and force is an awfully butch name for a bunch of priority check-in usherettes. Perhaps that's why increasingly they prefer to outsource it to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, a registered charity manned by volunteers and funded by donors, many of whom are none too happy about the RNLI's new role as shuttle taxis for the fast-track immigration service. As for France, just as what's happening on the Polish border is supposedly payback by Belarus for the sanctions, so what's going on the English coast is said to be payback by Monsieur Macron for Brexit. Let's break it all down with the former head of the border force in the UK, and before that, the head of border management in the magnificent Dominion of Canada. Tony Smith is with us. And Tony, let me start with that dual role of yours on either side of the Atlantic, because every country it's a little bit different. But there seems to be a general trend impervious to whatever the technical innovations are, and that is that the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, much of Western Europe all feel that it's somehow bad form to do anything serious about untrammeled illegal immigration across your borders. In other words, in a certain sense, as you must know from talking both to your political colleagues in Britain and Canada, that there's just a general antipathy toward actually rousing yourself because people fear they'll be called racist or whatever, or they'll be deemed to be anti-Somali, anti-Sudanese. Is it the same generally around the West now?
Well, I worked in the border force for over 40 years, man and boy. And when someone turned up at my border when I was an officer, if they didn't have a passport, I sent them straight back on the first vessel they arrived on, whether that was a plane or a boat. And if anyone was found on the beaches, then the same thing happened, basically. In fact, we simply wrote a letter out to whichever government they were, country they were from, even if they hadn't have a passport, and removed them. That was all back in the 70s and the 80s. What's happened since then has been this huge growth in asylum, where it's become common now, really, for anybody who doesn't qualify to cross a border to claim asylum. And because of a succession of judgments, mainly from the European Court, border force officers who are actually, I can assure you, very much in the business of enforcement, are not able to enforce the provisions of the national legislation because it's trumped by supranational laws, which means that the mention of the word asylum upon arrival in the UK, either on a beach or on an aircraft, means that the border force is disempowered from any enforcement activity and required simply to perform a humanitarian function to ensure that the migrants are safe and well, and many of them are not in a good condition when they arrive, and then put them into a process which is managed by the Asylum Directorate, which is an interminable process that the Home Secretary herself has already acknowledged to be broken. So I can assure you that the morale in the current border force is as low as probably it has been, because that's not what they were recruited to do. That's not what they want to do. But it is, I'm afraid, a byproduct of this growth in the international asylum legislation and the failure, frankly, of the French government to agree with us any kind of a treaty which would enable us to interdict people on the high seas and return them instantly to France.
Well, what actually is the difference between the French and the UK approach? Because the French don't seem to mind their country being used just as a shipping lane of human traffic if they're all headed to the UK. It seems to solve French and other continental problems in that those governments would rather those people went all the way over to Britain than stayed in the first EU country they entered. How can courts and governments on the continent not see that that's obviously a racket? We have asylum seekers who were in France. What's wrong with France?
Well, yes, exactly. But as you know, in most of Europe, in the Schengen zone, which France is a member of, there aren't any borders, of course. So once you're into the EU, and if you can get the main routes into the EU are through the Balkans or across the Mediterranean, then it's an open corridor all the way to Calais. And so the member states themselves cannot agree a quota of asylum seekers between them. In fact, you've seen things that are happening now down on the Poland-Belarus border, where you have Polish border guards lined up keeping migrants out of Belarus and Belarus pushing them towards the EU. And similarly, the EU have a very fragile agreement with Turkey, where people arriving on the Greek islands are in fact returned to the Turkish government, but that's because they have an agreement with the Turkish government. So don't you think it's a little bit of a hypocritical situation that we find with the EU, where on their eastern front they are actually turning people back, on their western front, which is us now, they're not prepared to accept people back. And I think therein lies the problem. And what we really need is to sit down with the French government and come to an agreement that will save lives, stop people drowning, and put the international organised crime gangs out of business. Because at the moment, they are making vast amounts of money out of human misery.
You're absolutely right on that, Tony. Human trafficking has become a huge global business. And if you look at the fertility rates in large parts of the world, it's only going to become even more of a multi-billion-dollar business in the years ahead, unless we come up with some serious plan to arrest it now. Thank you very much for that, Tony, and thank you for your 40 years, man and boy, with border enforcement in both the UK and Canada.